It seems that some people's prayers have finally been answered. Today we're looking at the MSI MPG 272URX, which sports a 26.5-inch flat glossy QD-OLED panel that runs a resolution of 4K and a refresh rate of 240Hz. Yes indeed, high refresh rate, high resolution and a high pixel density, given the overall form factor. Now at the time of filming and in the UK it can be found for £1,000, while in the US it can be found for $1,100. Now in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and of course how it performs across the board. So to kick things off, let's talk about its input lag, and here I was actually left jaw-dropped by how well it was able to perform in a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike 2 and Valorant. Yes indeed, my mouse inputs were instantaneous and I had no issues whatsoever. Of course, I can't imagine most people looking at this monitor and therefore taking it in a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike or indeed Valorant, but nonetheless here it's good to know that its input lag is actually very impressive. Furthermore, its overall response time is also extraordinarily good, and this is thanks to the fact it has got a QD-OLED panel. Using the OSRD tool, I was able to notice an average initial time of just 0.72, as you'll be able to see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And just above, you'll also see the perfect 100% in window, and that means it is really hitting that 240Hz refresh rate consistently. Now with that in mind, hitting 240Hz consistently at 4K is near on impossible, even if you have the beefiest GPU out there on the market. I say this because some people might actually forget that hitting 240Hz at 4K is actually quite hard to do consistently. And I'm saying consistently, by that I mean your baseline should be 240, not your maximum refresh rate of 240Hz, and therefore your minimums, let's say, are dropping to, let's say, 60. Nonetheless, it's good to see this monitor has got those capabilities, so therefore if you have got the most beefiest GPU out there on the market and or you potentially might look to upgrade in the future, then you'll be pleased to know that this monitor has got those capabilities. Now as for the overall motion clarity, I was actually left pretty impressed. At 240Hz, it does a really good job. Now it's worth mentioning of course over here that you do not have any sort of motion blur reduction technologies, which is no surprise given it has got an OLED panel. Some manufacturers have integrated this, but there are some caveats. So therefore at 240Hz you can actually benefit from MBR. Now with that in mind, the overall motion clarity is actually near perfect, and that's because you've got no inverse ghosting to worry about. That is usually kind of the silhouette or the highlight that you get behind an image when you're panning around, let's say, in a game, and this is something that plagues LCD panels, in other words, IPS, VAs and TNs. Given it has got that OLED panel technology, it means that you have got a fantastic image without having to worry about any of the negative visual impairments that you would get with a regular LCD. Another benefit from having a panel that's made of organic matter is the fact that you have got phenomenal HDR reproduction. Now it has got DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification, and it also has got a HDR 1000 peak mode. Now as the names might suggest, the True Black 400 mode would limit the overall brightness to roughly 400 nits, all while preserving better image quality, while the Peak 1000 mode will give you even higher brightness, but as a result you will not get as accurate image. Now I actually preferred using the True Black 400 mode even while gaming, because everything seemed to punch a little bit better in terms of the overall color, and the saturation just seemed a little bit better. But of course you can play around with this by selecting one of the modes via the OSD, and by easily flicking between the two, it means that no matter what sort of game or movie you're watching, you can really get the best out of the monitor. Now elsewhere, I would also like to mention that in terms of adaptive sync technologies, this monitor does not have a built-in G-Sync module, although that's no surprise because this seems to be almost a dying breed. In this respect, however, you have got a VR range which sits from 48 up to 240Hz. And using my RTX 3080 and while connected over DisplayPort, I had no sort of black screen issues while running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. Although, very much like other OLED monitors out there on the market, I did notice a little bit of flickering. This wasn't something that really bothered me specifically while I was gaming, but in more of a static image or while slowly panning around at specifically lower refresh rates, I was able to notice a little bit of flickering. Again, this is a little bit more emphasized while looking at the camera, so my camera will be able to pick this up a little bit better than the naked eye, but it's just something I thought I should highlight just in case you've got overly sensitive eyes. Now, a quick word for console gamers out there, and here the monitor has got full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, which not only allows you to output 4K at 120Hz, but also allows you to benefit from adaptive sync technologies, such as AMD FreeSync, which will be present on modern day consoles. Now, of course, if you're on PC, you can also utilize HDMI 2.1 because here it can go up to 240Hz as well. Now, using the OSRD tool at 120Hz, I clocked in an average initial time of 0.7 milliseconds, with a percent in window sitting at a perfect 100%. Similarly, when it comes to 60Hz, I clocked in an average initial time of 0.68 milliseconds, and yet again the percent in window sat at 100%. In terms of the motion clarity, it is going to be degraded over the highest refresh rate of 240Hz, but it's still actually pretty good, given the fact that yet again you are not getting any sort of negative visual impairment, given the fact that you have got an OLED panel. So moving on from the gaming performance, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, as a reminder, you have got a 26.5-inch flat glossy QD-OLED panel that has a resolution of 4K. And the combination of all of this means that you've got a very high pixel density of 166. And comparing and contrasting it to some of the alternatives out there that have got a 31.5 to 32-inch form factor, then here the overall text will look a little bit sharper. It is worth bearing in mind, however, that you might want to adjust your window scaling in order to adjust for the slightly smaller size while retaining that very high resolution. Now, there is also another thing that I would like to highlight is that it has got that glossy panel, which certain people will appreciate. However, it's worth pointing out that if you have got a very bright sunlit room, or for example a window that's positioned just behind you and therefore facing the monitor, then you will incur quite a bit of reflection. So make sure it can fit in your setup before actually purchasing it. In terms of the overall raw color performance, it has got a dedicated sRGB, Adobe RGB and Display P3 modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. It's also good to see that you've got full brightness controls. Now, concentrating on the sRGB mode, via my calibrators, I was able to measure a gamut coverage of 97.2% and a gamut volume of 99.6%. Below you can see how it compares to the sRGB standard. The average LTE sits at a very impressive 1.03, where closer to 0 is perfect, and a maximum of 2.47. Therefore, this monitor can be used for serious image editing work or video grading. As for its tested contrast ratio, it sits at infinity to 1, given it has got an OLED panel, and its measured white point sat at 6233 Kelvin at 100%. In terms of the gamma curve, it sits pretty close to the 2.2 standard. Now, if you're not going to be editing in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor by selecting one of the other modes, or indeed going for the user presets, which I suspect a lot of people will be doing with the latter because they're going to be gamers rather than those people who are looking at it in terms of a professional sense. In this respect, you might want to select one of the other modes in order to get a little bit of extra pop from your image. Now, aside from color accuracy, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here in the True Black 400 mode, I recorded a peak of 458 nits, while in the Peak 1000 mode, it sat pretty close to what it was expected. As for its SDR brightness, it sat at 256 nits, and it got all the way down to 29 nits. In essence, over here, even in SDR, it does get pretty bright, although you'll probably have to run it at roughly 70 to 80% brightness if you have got a bright sunlit room. In terms of the minimum brightness, it also allows you to use the monitor without having too much eye strain in a completely pitch black environment. Another thing that might be also of importance is brightness uniformity, and here on my tested panel, which I do appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, it did a decent job across the board, although it had some little bit of errors towards the left-hand side. As for the backlight bleed, well, it's non-existent given the fact it's an OLED panel, and therefore it can switch off all the pixels independently, giving you a completely pitch black environment. Now, before going out and buying this monitor or indeed any sort of OLED, I would just like to remind you there are certain considerations that you should have. Indeed, this might be important for some people coming from a regular LCD panel, in other words an IPS VA or TN. And of course here I'm talking about the burn-in effect. This is something that plagues any sort of OLED, be it a large TV to a smaller size monitor. And here, thankfully, you have got ways of mitigating it. This is by enabling certain technologies via the monitor's OSD, such as pixel shift, panel protect, static screen detection, boundary detection, taskbar detection, and multi-logo detection. You've also got an auto warning, and which will effectively give you a certain indication of when you should run a sort of pixel refresh. This will be done either automatically when you go into standby, or will have to make sure that you have a little bit of downtime when you're using this monitor. It's not exactly a deal breaker, but again, something that might throw certain people off guard when they're coming from a regular LCD monitor. Now, another thing you should consider is the overall fringing effect. And for those people who are not aware, it's just due to the sub-pixel layout of an OLED monitor in comparison to a regular LCD, and of course how your operating system is dealing with it. Thankfully here, you have got that 4K resolution and that 26.5-inch form factor, therefore giving you very high pixel density, and this effectively negates the overall fringing effect. In fact, from my own test, it was very hard to notice. Of course, it is still there in comparison to a regular LCD monitor, but in comparison to some of the other OLEDs out there, this QD-OLED panel actually does do a tremendous job. And therefore, if you're reading a lot of text like I do on a monitor, then I don't think you'll find it to be a problem. Now, past all of this, I would like to have a word about its overall build quality, and here you've got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel, although it's worth mentioning over here it's not quite got a borderless design because there's a little bit of a black edge. Nonetheless, it doesn't really bother me. The 26.5-inch form factor also doesn't take up too much space on my desk, which is certainly appreciated. The stand itself is also pretty ergonomic and also provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, although it can be sometimes a little bit stiff to raise up and down the monitor. Of course, you can replace the monitor stand if you so wish with a VESA compatible stand, allowing you to mount it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now, the back of the monitor you might have noticed an RGB strip, and yes, it is somewhat redundant unless you want to entertain your wall. Nonetheless, over here, if you do want to customize the RGB behavior or indeed fully disable it in order to preserve a little bit of energy, then you'll be able to do so via the monitor's OSD. There's a small little joystick button that's found at the bottom and at the center and back of the monitor. Now, the monitor's OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and also provides you all the right options that you'll require. Furthermore, as an extension to this, MSI have provided you the gaming intelligence software, which therefore gives you a further extension to what you can find via the hardware-based OSD with extra bit of customization, which is certainly appreciated. Here you'll also be able to check for the latest firmware updates, which can be handy in certain scenarios. Of course, if that is the case, you'll make sure that you want to have the USB cable, in other words USB Type A to Type B cable, connected to your computer. Speaking of which, the monitor has got a built-in KVM switch, and for those people who are unaware, it means you can plug in your peripherals, in other words your mouse and keyboard, directly into the monitor and have two separate sources. For example, a laptop connected over USB Type-C and a desktop computer connected over the USB cable and the HDMI or indeed DisplayPort cable. Now, this actually brings me on to connectivity, and here you have got two HDMI 2.1 ports, one DisplayPort 2.1A port with UHBR 20 and a USB Type-C port, which is also capable of delivering 98 watts of power, so therefore making it quite handy if you want to simultaneously charge your laptop while utilizing it. Elsewhere, you've got two USB Type A ports, which are useful for example connecting up your peripherals, and then you've got a 3.5mm jack output for your headphones. It's worth noting over here that the monitor has not got any sort of built-in speakers, so indeed if you do want to route audio directly via the monitor, you'll have to use that headphone jack. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the MSI MPG 272URX. And truth be told, I've been left really impressed across the board by what the manufacturer's been able to achieve. See, you've got that 4K resolution with a 26.5-inch form factor, giving you high pixel density. You then have got a high refresh rate with phenomenal response times and input lag, making it suitable for even hardcore gamers. That is, of course, if you can output 4K at 240Hz in the first place. Then you have got fantastic color accuracy, a phenomenal HDR reproduction with adaptive sync technologies which are supported, a comprehensively laid out OSD with software support, and also a really nice design. Now, given all of this, I can certainly see myself recommending it, and as such, it gets my Best Buy award. Now, of course, do consider that if you are not too keen about the smaller form factor, you can save yourself a pretty penny by getting a larger monitor. I know that might sound counterintuitive to some, but the larger monitor is more mass-produced and therefore brings down the price. Some of which I've reviewed will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and if you'd pay that extra premium for that smaller form factor in order to get that higher pixel density. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.